My name is Detective Rachel Martinez, and I've been serving with the Seattle Police Department for 17 years. In nearly 2 decades of investigating the darkest aspects of human behavior, I've encountered every type of criminal you can imagine. But sometimes you meet someone whose story forces you to question everything you believe about justice, motherhood, and the lengths a parent will go to when they believe their child has been murdered. This is the story that Sarah Coleman told me 8 months ago, sitting in her maximum security prison cell where she's serving 5 consecutive life sentences for first-degree murder. When Sarah first agreed to speak with me, I expected to hear the typical justifications and excuses that most killers use to rationalize their actions. Instead, I heard the heartbreaking confession of a mother whose love for her son had transformed her into something she never thought she could become. Sarah Coleman was 34 years old when she committed the murders that would define the rest of her life. She worked as a registered nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital, a position she had held for 9 years. Sarah wasn't wealthy, wasn't particularly ambitious in terms of career advancement, and wasn't someone who stood out in a crowd. But she was completely, utterly devoted to her 8-year-old son Jack, and that devotion would ultimately become both her greatest strength and her most devastating weakness. Sarah had raised Jack as a single mother since he was 2 years old, when his father abandoned them for another woman. The loss had been devastating for Sarah, but she had forced herself to keep going for Jack's sake, working extra shifts at the hospital to support them both while never missing a single important moment in her son's life. "Detective Martinez," Sarah said, her voice filled with a mixture of love and profound sadness. "Jack was the most amazing little boy you could ever imagine. He was smart, funny, curious about everything. He wanted to be a doctor when he grew up, just like the ones who worked with me at the hospital. He would come to my workplace sometimes after school, and all the staff loved him." Jack Coleman was indeed a remarkable child. His teachers consistently praised his intelligence, creativity, and kindness toward other children. Despite being raised by a single mother on a nurse's salary, Jack never seemed to feel deprived or resentful. He understood that his mother worked hard to provide for him, and he was grateful for everything she did. Sarah would wake up every morning at 5:30 a.m. to prepare Jack's breakfast and lunch, help him get ready for school, and drive him to Lincoln Elementary before starting her shift at the hospital. In the evenings, she would pick him up from after-school care, help him with his homework, and spend time talking about his day, his dreams, and his plans for the future. "Jack was my entire world," Sarah told me, her eyes taking on a distant look as she remembered those happier times. "After his father left, I poured all my love and energy into raising him. Every decision I made, every sacrifice I made, was for Jack. I wanted to give him the best life possible, even if we didn't have much money." For 6 years, Sarah and Jack built a life together that, while not luxurious, was rich in love and stability. They lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment near the hospital. Nothing fancy but comfortable and filled with Jack's artwork, school projects, and the sound of his laughter. Sarah had never remarried, dedicating herself completely to her career and her son. She occasionally dated, but no relationship ever developed seriously because Jack always came first, and Sarah refused to bring anyone into their lives who might disrupt the stability they had created together. Jack was a healthy, active child who loved soccer, video games, and reading adventure books. He had never been seriously ill, never been hospitalized, never given Sarah any reason to worry about his physical well-being. That's why what happened on a Tuesday morning in September came as such a devastating shock. Sarah was working the night shift at the hospital when she received the call that would change everything. It was 6:30 a.m. and she was preparing to go home when her phone rang. The caller ID showed Lincoln Elementary School. "Miss Coleman." The voice belonged to Mrs. Patterson, Jack's 3rd-grade teacher. "I'm calling because Jack isn't here yet, and he's never late. I was wondering if he's sick today." Sarah's blood turned cold. She had left Jack at home the night before when she went to work. As she always did when she worked night shifts, Jack was responsible for his age and had a key to their apartment, and their neighbor Mrs. Chen checked on him every evening. The arrangement had worked perfectly for 2 years. "He should be there," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Let me call home." Sarah tried calling their home phone, but there was no answer. She tried Jack's cell phone, a simple device she had given him for emergencies, but it went straight to voicemail. Sarah left the hospital immediately and drove home at dangerous speeds, her mind racing through every possible explanation. Maybe Jack was sick and had overslept. Maybe he had forgotten to charge his phone. Maybe Mrs. Chen had taken him to her apartment for some reason. But when Sarah arrived at their apartment building, She found Mrs. Chen waiting in the hallway, her face pale with worry. "Sarah," Mrs. Chen said, "Jack never came home from school yesterday. I waited for him until 7 o'clock, then knocked on your door, but no one answered. I thought maybe he was staying with a friend or that you had changed your schedule." Sarah felt the world tilt around her. Jack never stayed with friends without permission, never changed plans without telling her, never disappeared without explanation. Sarah called the police immediately, but their initial response was less than helpful. The responding officer, Sergeant Williams, took down the basic information, but seemed skeptical about the urgency of the situation. "Kids this age sometimes act impulsively," Sergeant Williams said. "Maybe he went to a friend's house and forgot to call. Maybe he's upset about something and decided to hide somewhere. Give it a few more hours and he'll probably turn up on his own." But Sarah knew her son. Jack was responsible, predictable, and deeply attached to their routine. He would never disappear voluntarily, never cause her worry intentionally, never fail to come home or call without a very serious reason. Sarah spent the next 48 hours in a state of pure panic, calling everyone she could think of, searching every place Jack might have gone, posting his picture on social media and around the neighborhood. The police treated the case as a routine missing child report, suggesting that Jack had probably run away and would return when he got hungry or homesick. On the third day, Jack's body was found in a construction site 2 miles from their apartment. The medical examiner determined that he had died from complications related to a severe allergic reaction, but the circumstances of his death were suspicious enough to warrant an investigation. Jack's body showed signs that he had been restrained, and there were injection marks on his arms that suggested someone had administered substances to him. Most disturbing of all, Jack had been dead for at least 48 hours when his body was discovered, meaning he had died shortly after disappearing from school. The investigation revealed that Jack had been abducted from the school playground during recess by someone who had gained his trust. Security footage showed Jack leaving the playground, willingly with an adult figure whose face wasn't visible on camera. Sarah was devastated beyond description. Her beautiful, innocent son had been kidnapped, tortured, and murdered, and she couldn't understand who would want to hurt such a kind, harmless child. The police investigation initially focused on the possibility that Jack had been the victim of a random predator, but as detectives dug deeper, they discovered something that changed the entire direction of the case. Jack hadn't been killed by a stranger. He had been killed by a group of people Sarah knew and trusted, doctors and staff from Seattle Children's Hospital where Sarah worked. The truth began to emerge 3 weeks after Jack's death, when Detective Michael Torres called Sarah to his office for what she thought would be a routine update on the investigation. "Ms. Coleman," Detective Torres said gently, "we've made some discoveries that I need to discuss with you." "This is going to be very difficult to hear." Detective Torres explained that their investigation had uncovered evidence of a medical research conspiracy involving several doctors at Seattle Children's Hospital. These doctors had been conducting illegal human experiments, testing experimental drugs and procedures on children without parental consent or proper ethical oversight. The doctors involved in this conspiracy targeted children from single-parent homes. Detective Torres continued, "Children whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. Children whose parents didn't have the resources or connections to demand answers." Sarah stared at Detective Torres in shock and horror. "You're telling me that people I work with, people I trusted, kidnapped and murdered my son for medical experiments?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Detective Torres confirmed. "Jack was abducted as part of this research program. The injection marks on his body indicate that he was used to test an experimental allergy medication that proved to be fatally toxic. The doctors involved in the conspiracy were Dr. Richard Steinberg, the head of pediatric research, Dr. Amanda Foster, a specialist in childhood allergies, Dr. Kevin Walsh, an anesthesiologist, Dr. Lisa Park, a resident in pediatric surgery, and Robert Jenkins, a lab technician who had helped coordinate the abductions and cover-ups. These 5 people had been operating their illegal research program for over 2 years, targeting at least a dozen children from low-income families. Jack had been their latest victim, chosen because Sarah worked night shifts and because they believed his disappearance would be attributed to parental negligence rather than kidnapping. "The most horrific part," Detective Torres said, "is that they chose Jack specifically because they knew you. They had observed your schedule, your relationship with your son, and your vulnerabilities. They targeted your child because they thought they could get away with it." Sarah felt something break inside her that would never be repaired. The people she had worked alongside for years, the people she had trusted with other children's lives, had murdered her son in cold blood. For the sake of medical research that wasn't even legal or ethical. What happens to them now? Sarah asked. Detective Torres looked uncomfortable. That's complicated. Dr. Steinberg and Dr. Foster have already hired very expensive lawyers. They're claiming that the research was legitimate and that Jack's death was an accidental overdose during approved treatment. Approved by whom? Sarah demanded. They're claiming that you gave consent for experimental treatment of Jack's allergies. Sarah felt like she had been punched in the stomach. Jack didn't have allergies, and I never gave consent for any treatment. We know that, Detective Torres said. But they've produced forged documents with your signature. They're arguing that you approved the treatment and that Jack died due to an unforeseeable complication, not murder. Over the following weeks, Sarah watched in horror as the 5 people responsible for her son's death began to escape justice through legal maneuvering, forged documents, and expensive defense attorneys. Dr. Steinberg claimed that the research program had been approved by an ethics board that conveniently had no records of their meetings or decisions. Dr. Foster produced fabricated medical records, suggesting that Jack had a history of severe allergies that required experimental treatment. Dr. Walsh claimed he had been told that Jack's mother had consented to the procedures. The district attorney's office was reluctant to pursue murder charges without ironclad evidence, especially against prominent doctors who could afford to fight the charges indefinitely. The case was complicated by the forged documents, and the defendant claims that they had been conducting legitimate medical research. Detective Martinez, Sarah said to me, her voice taking on a cold, determined tone that still chills me too. Remember, I realized that the legal system was going to fail my son just like it fails so many other victims. These people had murdered Jack in cold blood, and they were going to walk free because they had money and connections and the ability to manipulate the system. 3 months after Jack's death, the district attorney announced that while there was evidence of medical malpractice and ethics violations, there was insufficient evidence to pursue murder charges against the 5 defendants. They would face only administrative sanctions and civil lawsuits. Sarah watched the press conference where this decision was announced, standing in the back of the room while Dr. Steinberg's lawyer spoke about his client's relief and vindication. She saw Dr. Foster smile as she left the courthouse, saw Dr. Walsh shake hands with his attorney, saw all 5 of them walk away free while her son lay in his grave. That night, Sarah Coleman made a decision that would transform her from a grieving mother into a methodical killer. The legal system had failed her son, but she would not fail him. If these people couldn't be brought to justice through legal channels, she would bring justice to them through other means. Sarah began planning her revenge with the same attention to detail and medical precision that she used in her nursing work. She researched each of her targets, learning their routines, their habits, their schedules, and their vulnerabilities. Most importantly, she began acquiring the tools she would need to kill them in ways that would make them understand exactly what they had put her son through. Sarah's transformation from devoted mother to calculating killer had begun, driven by grief that had curdled into hatred and a thirst for vengeance that would consume everything in its path. The 5 people who thought their money and influence had protected them from consequences were about to learn that some mothers will go to any lengths to avenge their children, even if it means sacrificing their own souls in the process. Sarah's first target was Robert Jenkins, the lab technician who had helped coordinate Jack's abduction and the subsequent cover-up. Sarah chose Jenkins first because he was the most vulnerable of her targets, lacking the wealth and connections that protected the doctors involved in the conspiracy. Sarah spent 2 months studying Jenkins's routine, learning that he lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of Seattle and frequently worked late shifts at the hospital. She discovered that Jenkins had a history of drug addiction and had been in financial trouble, making him susceptible to the doctor's recruitment for their illegal research program. Detective Martinez, Sarah told me, her voice taking on the cold, clinical tone that had characterized all her killings. I wasn't angry anymore when I went after Jenkins. Anger is hot and impulsive. What I felt was something much more controlled and focused. I had work to do. Sarah used her access to the hospital's medication supplies to acquire a combination of drugs that would simulate the effects of the experimental allergy medication that had killed Jack. She wanted each of her victims to experience exactly what her son had experienced in his final moments. On a Thursday evening in February, Sarah broke into Jenkins's house while he was at work. She knew his schedule perfectly, knew that he wouldn't return home until after midnight, and knew that his neighbors rarely paid attention to activity at his house. Sarah waited in Jenkins's bedroom holding a syringe filled with the lethal combination of medications she had prepared. When Jenkins arrived home, drunk from an evening at a nearby bar, Sarah was ready for him. "Robert Jenkins," Sarah said calmly as Jenkins stumbled into his bedroom. Jenkins turned around, confused and frightened to see someone in his house. When he recognized Sarah from the hospital, his confusion turned to terror. "Sarah, what are you doing here? How did you get in?" "I'm here to give you the same treatment you gave my son," Sarah replied. "The same experimental medication that killed Jack." Jenkins tried to run, but the alcohol had made him clumsy and slow. Sarah easily overpowered him, using the physical strength she had developed from years of moving, patience and medical equipment. Sarah injected Jenkins with a lethal drug combination, then sat beside his bed and watched as he experienced the same allergic reaction that had killed Jack. Jenkins convulsed, struggled to breathe, and eventually died in the same agony that her 8-year-old son had endured. "I wanted him to understand what he had put Jack through," Sarah told me. "I wanted him to feel every moment of pain and terror that my son had felt." Jenkins's body was discovered 3 days later when he failed to show up for work. The cause of death was initially ruled as a drug overdose, which seemed consistent with Jenkins's history of addiction. The police had no reason to suspect murder, and no evidence pointed towards Sarah as a suspect. Sarah's second target was Dr. Lisa Park, the pediatric surgery resident, who had participated in the illegal experiments. Dr. Park was younger and less experienced than the other doctors, but Sarah held her equally responsible for Jack's death. Dr. Park lived in an upscale apartment complex downtown and maintained a busy social schedule that made her movements predictable. Sarah learned that Dr. Park frequently jogged alone through Discovery Park in the early morning hours before her hospital shifts. On a foggy Tuesday morning in March, Sarah waited along Dr. Park's jogging route, dressed in athletic clothing and carrying a water bottle that contained the same lethal drug combination she had used on Jenkins. When Dr. Park stopped to rest at a secluded bench, Sarah approached her pretending to be a fellow jogger in need of directions. "Excuse me," Sarah said politely. "Do you know the way back to the parking lot? I think I got turned around." Dr. Park looked up and Sarah saw recognition dawn in her eyes. They had worked together at the hospital, though not closely. Sarah Coleman, what are you doing here?" "Getting justice for my son," Sarah replied calmly. Before Dr. Park could react, Sarah grabbed her and forced her to drink the poisoned water. The drugs took effect quickly in Dr. Park's system, causing the same rapid allergic reaction that had killed Jack. Sarah stayed with Dr. Park until she died, watching her struggle and convulse just as Jack had done. She wanted each of her victims to see her face as they died, to understand why they were being killed and what they had brought upon themselves. Dr. Park's body was found by another jogger 2 hours later. The medical examiner ruled the death as sudden cardiac arrest during exercise, a tragic but not uncommon occurrence among young adults who pushed themselves too hard physically. Sarah's third target was Dr. Kevin Walsh, the anesthesiologist who had sedated Jack during the experimental procedures. Dr. Walsh was older and more cautious than Dr. Park, but he had a weakness that Sarah could exploit: his gambling addiction. Sarah learned that Dr. Walsh frequented underground poker games in warehouse districts around Seattle, often staying out until dawn and drinking heavily while gambling away his medical salary. Sarah followed Dr. Walsh to one of these games and waited in the parking lot until he emerged, alone and intoxicated. Around 4 a.m., she approached him as he stumbled toward his car. "Dr. Walsh," Sarah called out. Walsh turned, squinting in the dim light. "Do I know you?" "I'm Sarah Coleman. I worked at Children's Hospital. You killed my son Jack." Walsh's expression changed from confusion to fear as he recognized Sarah and understood the implications of her presence. "Sarah, listen, that was a terrible accident. We never meant for any child to be hurt. The research was supposed to help children with allergies. You injected experimental drugs into my 8-year-old son without my consent." Sarah said quietly. "You watched him die in agony and then you helped cover it up." Walsh tried to get into his car, but Sarah was faster. She tackled him to the ground and injected him with the same lethal drug combination that had killed Jenkins and Dr. Park. Walsh experienced the same horrific allergic reaction, but Sarah made sure he remained conscious long enough to understand what was happening to him and why. "This is what you did to Jack," Sarah whispered as Walsh convulsed beside his car. "This is what my innocent little boy went through because of your illegal Experiments. Walsh's body was discovered the next morning by a security guard. The police assumed he had been the victim of a robbery gone wrong, killed by criminals who frequented the area around the illegal gambling operations. Sarah's fourth target was Dr. Amanda Foster, the allergy specialist who had designed the experimental medication that killed Jack. Dr. Foster was the most paranoid of Sarah's targets, having become suspicious after the deaths of Jenkins, Dr. Park, and Dr. Walsh. Dr. Foster had hired a private security firm and changed her routines, making her much more difficult to approach safely. But Sarah's nursing background gave her an advantage that Dr. Foster hadn't anticipated. Sarah learned that Dr. Foster's elderly mother was a patient at Seattle General Hospital, receiving treatment for advanced cancer. Dr. Foster visited her mother every evening, and the hospital's security was focused on preventing general crime rather than protecting visitors from specific threats. Sarah infiltrated Seattle General Hospital by volunteering for their patient support program, giving her legitimate access to the building and the ability to move freely through the corridors. On a Wednesday evening in May, Sarah followed Dr. Foster to her mother's hospital room. She waited until Dr. Foster was alone with her mother, then entered the room wearing scrubs and carrying medical supplies. "Dr. Foster," Sarah said calmly. Dr. Foster looked up from her mother's bedside, her face immediately showing recognition and terror. "Sarah Coleman," Dr. Foster whispered. "You killed Robert and Lisa and Kevin." "The same way you killed my son," Sarah confirmed. Dr. Foster's mother was unconscious from medication, unaware of the confrontation taking place beside her bed. Dr. Foster tried to call for help, but Sarah had disabled the call button and locked the door. "Please," Dr. Foster begged. "I have children too. I know you're in pain, but killing me won't bring Jack back." "No," Sarah agreed. "But it will ensure that you never hurt another child the way you hurt mine." Sarah injected Dr. Foster with a massive dose of the experimental allergy medication, the same substance that had killed Jack. She wanted Dr. Foster to die from her own creation, to experience firsthand the effects of the drug she had designed and tested on innocent children. Dr. Foster's death was more prolonged and agonizing than the others, as Sarah had increased the dosage to ensure maximum suffering. Dr. Foster convulsed for nearly 20 minutes, before finally succumbing to the allergic reaction. Sarah left the hospital calmly, her volunteer badge giving her the perfect cover for her presence in the Opus building. Dr. Foster's body was discovered an hour later by a night nurse, and her death was initially attributed to a stress-induced heart attack brought on by her mother's terminal illness. Sarah's final target was Dr. Richard Steinberg, the head of pediatric research who had organized and overseen the entire illegal experimentation program. Dr. Steinberg was the most heavily protected of her targets, with both private security and law enforcement connections. That made him nearly untouchable. But Sarah had been saving her most elaborate plan for Dr. Steinberg, the man she held most responsible for Jack's death. She wanted his death to be not just painful, but public, ensuring that the world would know why he had been killed and what he had done to deserve it. Sarah learned that Dr. Steinberg was scheduled to deliver a keynote address at the annual Pacific Northwest Medical Conference, an event that would be attended by hundreds of doctors and medical professionals from across the region. Sarah used her nursing credentials to volunteer at the conference, giving her access to the venue and the ability to prepare the location where Dr. Steinberg would be speaking. On the day of the conference, Sarah arrived early and set up medical equipment in the room where Dr. Steinberg would give his presentation. She had prepared a special version of the experimental allergy medication, one that would work more slowly and dramatically than the doses she had used on her previous victims. As Dr. Steinberg began his presentation on pediatric research ethics, a topic that Sarah found bitterly ironic, she approached the podium carrying what appeared to be routine medical supplies. "Dr. Steinberg," Sarah said loudly, enough for the audience to hear, "I have something for you from Jack Coleman." Dr. Steinberg looked confused, but before he could react, Sarah had injected him with the lethal medication. "This woman killed my 8-year-old son," Sarah announced to the shocked audience. "She conducted illegal medical experiments on children, and when my son died from their experimental drugs, they covered it up and walked away free." As Dr. Steinberg began to experience the effects of the medication, Sarah continued her public confession. "Dr. Richard Steinberg, Dr. Amanda Foster, Dr. Kevin Walsh, Dr. Lisa Park, and Robert Jenkins abducted my son from his school, used him as a test subject for illegal drug experiments, and then forged documents to cover up their crimes when he died. The audience watched in horror as Dr. Steinberg collapsed on stage, convulsing and struggling to breathe just as Jack had done months earlier. "I killed all 5 of them," Sarah said calmly, "because the legal system failed my son. They thought their money and connections would protect them from justice. They were wrong." Security guards rushed toward Sarah, but she made no attempt to escape. She stood calmly beside Dr. Steinberg's dying body, waiting to be arrested. "I'm done," Sarah told the officers who handcuffed her. "They all paid for what they did to Jack. My work is finished." Sarah's trial became a media sensation, dividing the public between those who saw her as a vigilante, who had achieved justice for her murdered son, and those who viewed her as a cold-blooded killer who had taken the law into her own hands. The prosecution painted Sarah as a dangerous individual who had systematically murdered 5 people in premeditated attacks. They argued that her nursing background had given her the knowledge and access needed to commit these crimes, and that her methodical planning showed clear intent to commit murder. The defense tried to argue temporary insanity, claiming that Sarah had been driven mad by grief and the failure of the justice system to prosecute her son's killers. They presented evidence of the illegal medical experimentation program and argued that Sarah's victims had essentially murdered Jack and escaped punishment. But during the trial, a devastating revelation emerged that changed everything. Sarah thought she knew about her son's death and her quest for revenge. Dr. Helen Morrison, an independent medical examiner who had been brought in to review Jack's case, testified that the experimental allergy medication had not actually killed Jack Coleman. According to Dr. Morrison's analysis, Jack had died from a rare genetic condition called sudden arrhythmia death syndrome, a condition that causes the heart to stop beating without warning. The experimental medication found in Jack's system had been administered after his death, apparently as part of a cover-up to conceal the medical research program. The child died of natural causes, Dr. Morrison testified. The experimental medication was injected post-mortem to make it appear that the research program had caused his death, when in fact the death was completely unrelated to any medical intervention. Sarah sat in the courtroom, listening to Dr. Morrison's testimony with growing horror and disbelief. Everything she had believed about Jack's death, everything that had motivated her killing spree, had been based on a misunderstanding. The doctors involved in the illegal research program discovered Mr. Coleman's body and panicked. Dr. Morrison continued. They injected the experimental medication to make it appear that he had been part of their research, thinking this would provide a cover story for his death. They never intended to kill the child, and in fact, they didn't kill him. The 5 people Sarah had murdered had been guilty of conducting illegal medical research and of covering up Jack's death after the fact. But they had not actually killed Jack. Her son had died of a rare genetic condition that no one could have prevented or predicted. Sarah's defense attorney tried to argue that this revelation proved her mental state was even more disturbed than previously thought, that she had been operating under a delusion that justified an insanity defense. But Sarah herself rejected this argument. When she took the stand to testify on her own behalf, she spoke with the same calm, clinical precision she had used to plan her murders. "I killed 5 people because I believed they had murdered my son," Sarah told the court. "I now understand that I was wrong about how Jack died. But I was not wrong about the illegal research program or the cover-up that followed his death." Sarah paused, looking directly at the jury. These people were not innocent victims. They conducted illegal experiments on children. They covered up a child's death to protect themselves, and they forged documents to avoid prosecution. They may not have killed Jack directly, but they were not good people who deserved to live. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all 5 counts of first-degree murder. Sarah was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Throughout her sentencing hearing, Sarah showed no remorse and expressed no regret for her actions. "Detective Martinez," Sarah said to me during our final interview, "people ask me if I regret killing those 5 people now, that I know they didn't directly cause Jack's death. The answer is no. They were criminals who exploited children and covered up their crimes. The world is better without them." Sarah paused, staring at the concrete walls of her prison cell. "But I do regret that I spent so much energy on revenge when I should have been grieving my son properly. I regret that I became a killer instead of honoring Jack's memory in a way that would have made him proud of me." As our interview concluded, I found myself struggling with the same questions that had haunted Sarah's case from the beginning. While the 5 doctors and Robert Jenkins had not directly killed Jack Coleman, they had been involved in illegal activities that exploited children and had covered up a child's death for their own protection. Sarah Coleman sits in prison today, serving 5 life sentences for murders she committed, based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how her son had died. She spends her days writing letters to Jack's grave, telling him about the justice she believes she achieved in his memory. Jack Coleman rests in Evergreen Cemetery, his gravestone bearing a simple inscription, "Beloved son, your light will never be forgotten." The case of Sarah Coleman serves as a stark reminder of how grief can transform love into hatred, and how the pursuit of justice can become indistinguishable from the pursuit of revenge. Sometimes the people we become in our darkest moments are far removed from the people we once were. And sometimes the price of vengeance is not just the lives we take, but the souls we sacrifice in the process. If this story affected you as deeply as it affected me, please subscribe to our channel for more true crime confessions that explore the complex motivations behind the darkest human actions. Next week, we'll hear from a father who discovered his daughter's secret and made a choice that destroyed his entire family. Until then, remember that the line between justice and revenge is often drawn in blood, and crossing it changes us in ways we can never undo.